So essentially, like, all of this stuff about changing your gender and your gender presentation and the relationship between body and world is in the air and really close to Joe's family. I also became super interested in this set of sociologists from Germany writing in the 1920s called the Wertings, Matilda and Paul Werting, who wrote a book called The Dominant Sex. And they were basically responding to like Voronov's work by basically saying, hey, if it turns out you can, you know, if we understand now that there are biological causes of things like body hair and, you know, things that we associate with men, but if we can change those things by injecting you with some monkey balls or other things, you know, if basically there's this way we can change your gender presentation, then maybe you can change your gender as well, right? So a really quite progressive thesis for the 1920s and explicitly drawing on the ideas that are coming from Joe Castairs' like stepfather, basically.
So essentially, ground up monkey balls in the early 20th century have made J.K. Rowling lose her fucking mind in 2023.
Yeah, apparently 2,000 monkey man testicle rejuvenations were administered from France to India. Like,
you just have a huge craving for potassium from bananas.
But so in The Dominant Sex, right, the Werting's book on this, their basic thesis is like essentially a sort of social constructivist theory, right? Like, it's not that there is any inherent characteristic of men or women, but that the things we associate in the contemporary West with men, things like bravery, strength, leadership, all of these kind of cliches and of the stereotype, they're actually more specifically, as far as they're concerned, features of the dominant sex. So in a society where women are in charge, it's femininity that would be associated with strength and leadership and virility. Does that make sense? Are you following?
Yeah.
And one of their arguments for this is actually tattooing. To bring it back to the topic of the podcast more specifically. So basically they thought, not without basis at the time, that ancient Egypt was a very female-dominated society. And as we talked about in a previous episode with Anne Austen, tattooing, as far as people at that time were concerned, in ancient Egypt was primarily something practiced by women, right? So they basically say, and again, I'll quote myself here. So their theory suggests cultural habits are considered male or female, depending on which sex is considered dominant in a given culture. The subordinate sex, they say, is the one that is wooed, explaining why in our patriarchal society, women are so interested in clothes, makeup, and hairstyling. Most importantly, members of the subordinate sex do not usually work outside the home and thus have more time and inclination to beautify themselves. Quote, we may presume that the inclination towards self-adornment displayed by members of the subordinate sex and the tendency of members of the dominant sex to dispense with ornaments and wear drab clothing are both intimately connected with the sexual division of labour. Those who belong to the sex which works in the home have more time and opportunity for self-adornment than those who belong to the sex which works away from home. And to summarise that, essentially they think like men have bad hair because they haven't got time to go to the hairdressers. And the reason they get tattooed is because it's much more efficient than putting on makeup every day.
Okay, fair.
Right? So it's
I
like...
don't necessarily agree, but...
Well, no, it's not actually true, obviously, right? But, like, this is the theoretical context in which, like, Joe's moment in time is happening, right? Like, this idea that, men have tattoos because they don't have time to put makeup on every day, right? It's very efficient. So yeah, it's not actually true, right? Or at least it's more complicated than that. But I think the fundamental idea here is something that we can basically say is correct, right? Our cultural associations of tattooing and the gender implications of them are obviously produced by social expectations of how men and women should behave, how they should dress, and how they're understood to relate to others. In some cultures around the world, and Teirangitu mentioned this when he did his talk at that conference we were at. Tattooing is a primarily female practice, so tattooing is a woman's practice. In others, it's a men's practice, and it's we talked about that with Maya Sialuk as well. So all of that's to say, right? Like, it's a lovely coincidence that at exactly the time that Joe Castairs is like basically becoming or changing her presentation into as masculine as is possible in her social circumstance, all of these conversations are happening about where gender comes from, what its relationship is to science, whether it's changeable or not. And yeah, like Joe basically, because she was rich as fuck, like she was like, I'm gonna become the world's fastest woman. In fact, the world's fastest person. During World War One, she'd become really interested in like engines. So she drove like trucks in the army. She took to kind of wearing like men's uniforms. She lived in Paris driving ambulances. She'd steal uniforms from men. And basically like was like, fuck it, I'm going to become a powerboat racer.
Naturally.
And
who hasn't thought about becoming a powerboat racer?
Yeah, she became like the most famous powerboat racer in the world. A group of 3 speed-obsessed riders called the Hell Divers. She ran a powerboat racing team, and was just. It's really funny to look at like newspaper reports about her because they don't quite know what to do with her. They call her Betty quite a lot, which was a name she hated as a diminutive of her middle name Barbara. And they sort of said she was like striking looking or occasionally pretty, but that feels not exactly fair.
Yeah, like that's a bit weird.
Yeah.